The event is co-presented by CCA's History of Art and Visual Culture program and Creative Citizens in Action. It is funded by an endowment gift to support the Deborah and Kenneth Novak Creative Citizens series at CCA, an annual series of public programs focused on creative activism.
Abigail.
Hi, my name is Abigail, and I'm a student in Professor Marina Puglisi's Contemporary Art course at California College of the Arts. I'm going to introduce fluid mutualism. This year, the theme of the Creative Citizen series is fluid mutualism. The series is exploring the intergenerational symbolic relationships, networks, and strategies developing within different communities, species, disciplines, and territories. Each event in the series is connected to one of the pillars of the communal flower, a model of understanding communality in the Asian philosophy and daily practice of various indigenous nations in southern Mexico. This event explored the pillar assembly according to the communal flower. The importance of the assembly resides in that it is here that we manifest our collective needs, where we contemplate alternatives of well-being that satisfy us, solutions, and where we decide the path that will define the destiny of our community.
Thank you. Ezra.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ezra. I'm also a student at CCA. And I just wanted to acknowledge that California College of the Arts, their campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived on this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. We endeavor to honor Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. Here and around the world, we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. If you are unsure of whose land, you can always visit nativeland.ca. Now I'll pass it to Marina.
Thank you, Ezra. Hello, everybody. My name is Marina Pugliese, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm adjunct to professor of contemporary art history at ABOC and head of public art for the city of Milan. And the first thing I want to say is that I would really love to thank CCA for CCA, and specifically Brindis after the Steer and Jimmy Austin for this grant, and which funded the seminar and the program, and Beth Mangini, my chair at ABOC, who encouraged me to apply. And this seminar is a series of three meetings in which we will analyze the topic of monumentality and anti-monumentality from different perspectives. And today, we will talk about the decision-making, and the decision-making is crucial, especially nowadays. The pandemic on the one hand and the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor have shown us how it is important that monuments speak to communities, that there are shared values, and that decisions are shared. And even for the city of Milan, we are now thinking about revisioning the policies. And so we wanted to share the process and understand the different policies on an international level. That's how I got in contact with Kendall Henry. And so it will be really interesting for us to understand what New York has done in order to democratize the process of decision-making in public art. So I'm passing the mic to Akaisha for an introduction to Kendall. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Acacia. I'm also a student in Marina's class. Kendall Henry is an artist and curator who lives in New York, and who also specializes in the field of public art and has been for over 30 years. He illustrates that public art can be used as a tool for social engagement, civic pride, and economic development through the projects and programs he's initiated in the US and internationally. He's currently the Assistant Commissioner of Public Art at the NYC Department of Cultural Affairs and an adjunct professor at New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development.
Thank you for that introduction. And I guess it's my turn to do the speaking, huh? So the idea of monuments and who creates them, and I mean, this whole idea about monuments has been to the forefront of a lot of our conversations throughout the past years, but it has been a conversation much before that. So, and I have many as Acacia, read my introduction, I have many different perspectives on this topic. But the topic that what will guide my discussion today is in my role as the Assistant Commissioner of Public Art for New York City, and how we as an organization through the Percent for Art program have led the process of really looking at how the city of New York, who is represented in our collection of monuments, and what we are doing to address that, rectify that, to examine that. And so the conversation I'll be having with you today is through those lenses. I encourage you, I'll be going all over the place because there's no straight line when you're dealing with monuments. I'll be highlighting some issues for particular projects. I'll be generalizing certain aspects of the program. So I encourage you to place in the chat any questions that you might have, and we could discuss them as at the end of my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen, and again, I have a lot to talk about and a lot of different aspects to address. And so hopefully, this will be at least a guide to some of the conversations that we could have during the questions and answer period. Okay, so I hope everybody could see the screen. You should see the New York Cultural Affairs logo and the Percent for Art program. So we are going to begin at the beginning. And one of the things that we really focus on is, what is this public art thing and how do you define that? And for our purposes at Cultural Affairs in New York City, we have very distinct ways of defining public art. And not to say one is better than the other, but just for clarity purposes. And so in the center of this, these two circles, you see art in public place. And when we say public art, we don't mean this kind of work per se. It's just, again, any artist or anyone could place a work of art in the public environment and call it public art. And I think this is important, though this is not what we mean by public art, because most of us don't end up going to museums and galleries and those exhibition spaces to experience that work. So bringing that work in the public environment is super important. And it's sort of really viable for us to understand the importance of the arts in our communities, even though we don't go into these art spaces. So when art in public place is different than when I say the word public art. And so when I say that word today, you will know exactly what I mean. And what I mean is to add an extra component to that definition. And so when we refer to public art in New York City, we add this other component, and that's the community. And you see in this illustration that each one of these components have an equal standing. So, and each one mean slightly different things. So art could mean the physical object that is created. It could mean the interaction with the artist. It could mean the process by which you create the work. So that falls on the art. Community could mean the people that you work with who are not necessarily artists, or sometimes they are artists, to create the work with. It could mean the audience that is going to receive the work. It could mean who is being represented and who is being given voice. And the public space, it could be, again, that space that the art and the community comes together to create the process for the work. It could mean where the place of the end product of the work will end up. So this congregation of the community, the art, the artist, the public space, that is necessary to make a successful work of public art. And so when I say public art, this is what I'm talking about. So just to give you a little history, because all this is relevant to how we look at work and how we consider when commissioning for a monument, I'm going to give you a little bit of history of the program. So it's actually a law, and many cities in all over the world, and particularly in the United States, has this something similar to what is called a percent for art law. And that basically says the city's building something, they take a percentage of that funds. That percentage is very different in different places, and how the percentage is calculated is very different. But when that particular city is building, a percentage of that construction cost is put aside for the commissioning of a permanent work of art that lives with the space, with the building. And so we have one of those laws. And so that is primarily where our funding for the arts, for the public art, comes from, though we have a number of different programs, temporary art programs, an artist in residency program that engage artists and the public in many ways. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to mostly focus on the percent for art program and that funding source. And so, and you'd be surprised to what is covered in that eligibility of the percent for art law, and things that you may not even consider. So, when we think about percent for art in public spaces, we think about the typical parks and schools and libraries, and but we don't think about spaces like detention centers or police stations and precincts and other spaces that may not have a public access component, like a sewage treatment plant, for example, or a salt shed. So all of these are eligible for public art, and sort of we use the opportunity to engage a public within those spaces. As you can imagine, some of these spaces are quite contentious. Depending on where you are, a detention center might, well, anywhere a detention center might be contentious. Depending where you are, a police station or a police precinct, or and these kinds of spaces may not have a good relationship with the community that they sit within, and so the art becomes an opportunity to hopefully create a buffer between the two, between these two entities and these two publics. And of course, monuments and memorials are covered in that as well. I'm going to sidetrack here a little bit. When we commission artists, we don't sort of impose a theme onto them. And so what I'm noticing right now is a lot of artists who are given commissions are choosing to create monuments with that commission, which is quite fantastic, actually. And so what is the process of commissioning an artwork? And so what we usually have a 2-panel process, and I'm gonna show you what that is. And it changes depending on what the project is, but it's a first meeting is an introduction of the program, so people understand why we're doing this and where that's coming from. The architect so it gives a really detailed information as to what the project is. There is a review of potential artists to be considered, and the end of that day, the end of that meeting, is to select finalists who will be paid and invited to produce proposals. 8 weeks later, there's a second meeting where we reintroduce everything to everybody, because 8 weeks is a long time for people to remember things. And then the goal of this is to sort of really listen to what the artists are proposing and ask them questions of it and sort of discuss. And at the end of that meeting, we select an artist. But before that even begins, there's a lot of work that has to be done. Because again, in that first image, one of the first images I showed you, community is a huge component of that. So before we even begin our first meeting, we sort of meet with the community and let them know that this is happening. We are going to be considering an artist, we are going to be commissioning an artwork, and we want them to be part of it. So, so we meet through the community board sometimes, and a lot of times community boards aren't a good representative of the community as a whole, but we meet with them and for a number of purposes. To one, inform. And two, to sort of really talk about who should we be talking to, who are stakeholders within this particular community that needs to be part of this process. And also, who are the artists that we need to contact to sort of be considered for this, and who are individuals who have an art background that could serve as panelists to make the ultimate decisions on these projects. So that is something that happens before we even begin our first panel, because again, it becomes a thought of like, who is making those decisions, who get to be part of those decisions, and who gets to create the work. And so that's very important for anything that we do. So I'm generalizing a lot of these things here now, and not really necessarily focusing on monuments, because this is consistent with how we address monuments, but all art projects, not just monuments, but all art projects. And so once we do that, then the panel composition itself is this. So there is a DCLA, is an acronym for the Department of Cultural Affairs. The commissioner or the designee chairs the meeting. And so I get a vote. I'm usually chair of that. A representative from the design agency. And the design agency for New York City is the agency that's actually going to be building whatever it is, be the park, the police station, the school. The sponsor agency it represents the entity that's going to occupy that space. So if it's the police facility, the school itself. So these are sponsor agencies. And then three representatives of the public. So these representatives of the public should know something about art, but they have to come from the community. They have to have some sort of art knowledge, but also some community knowledge. And I want you to really pay attention to this setting here. So 3 votes are for the city and 3 votes are for the public. So there's a sort of equal distribution as to who makes the decision. And then the advisory panelists are the architects and the design team. So you'd be surprised that the architect who's designing the project doesn't have a vote. The Public Design Commission, and this is a commission within New York City that ends up receiving the collection and takes care of the city's collection. You see the elected officials like the board president, city council members, community board representatives, as well as local organizations and community groups and the general public. So I think this is very important to highlight here. At the end of the day, the goal is to select, create, commission a work of art that responds to the community on a community level, but also not forgetting that it's a work of art and has to serve as such. And so the advisory panelists are not voting members, because when you look at the advisory panelists, you see their agendas might be slightly different than an art focus. The architect is really focusing on they architecture. The Public Design Commission, again, has a sort of a broader sense of the collection. But, people with in sort of political positions has a sort of a different perspective on these kinds of issues. And so again, we encourage, we beg these people to participate in the process, in the conversation, to inform the voting members. But again, when this composition was laid out, a lot of that was put into the thought process. Okay. So now we get into the monuments. And so how did we get here? How did we get here? So there's a lot that was happening in, particularly in the South, in 2017, when there was this sort of issues with the Confederate monuments and some of them being removed, and some of the interactions with that removal was quite violent. An individual lost her life, so that led us, New York City, to take a look at what's happening and what is in our collection, and sort of really make an assessment of that. And so the mayor announced the Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, Markers to convene and advise the mayor on issues surrounding public art and historic monuments and markers on city-owned property. And so the way we did that is there was an 18-member commission that represented quite the diversity of the city, and so to understand what the city was thinking, what the individuals in the city was thinking, They included a number of public hearings, and one for each borough. New York City has 5 boroughs, one for each borough. And the idea was, if you had an issue with any of the monuments or markers or public art that lived in the city, you had the opportunity to come up, have a 3-minute time slot, and voice your opinion, thoughts, and concerns. And so these meetings lasted as long as everybody got a chance to say what they needed to say. And so that was very important, because we kept hearing very similar things about similar monuments. We kept hearing opposing thoughts and perspectives on some of the same monuments. And so this kind of public meeting was very important in informing the advisory commission on how they should look at, and which monuments they should look at, and how they should look at them. So after 90 days of this, the commission released a report with a proposed deaccessioning process for what we consider controversial monuments and markers, and recommendations for specific ones to the mayor. And so they came up with maybe 6 ways to address some of the works. Some of them could remain in place, whether it be for many different reasons. Some of them could be recontextualized, meaning that perhaps there's more information that could be provided to these monuments to get a better understanding of who the individual was or what the event was about. Additive meant that you'd keep it in place, but add some extra, add other monuments perhaps, or add some other artworks, or not necessarily just information, but sort of to equalize the context of a troublesome monument. Create a counter monument. So, create another thing to have a conversation with this other one that wasn't an issue. To relocate, to remove from public view perhaps, or to put in another location that is not as problematic, and to just remove. So these were some of the 6 suggestions that the Monument Commission put forward, and they were to be applied to certain monuments. I'm going to share with you some of these that were troublesome, and for many different kinds of reasons. So we have here the, if you've been to New York, if you've been to Broadway, particularly in downtown, we have the Canyon of Heroes. And this is a down Broadway where we have the ticker tape parades. And throughout the many years of Broadway's existence, if there was somebody who accomplished something, they would get a ticker tape parade. And as a result of that, the parade would be the memory or the memorial or the would be emblazed into the sidewalk with the date and the individual that was celebrated. And so there were ones where that the name Muhammad was part of the individual's name. And for certain cultures, the Muslim community culture, for example, felt that having the name Muhammad on the ground where people would walk over it was disrespectful, right? And so nobody had thought of that before until it sort of was brought up. Sticking with the Canyon of Heroes, really looking at who was being celebrated in that way, brought up some issues as some of the individuals. For example, Henry Philippe Pétain was a Nazi collaborator during the Holocaust, and people felt a concern that why are you labeling this individual in a place that you call Canyon of Heroes, right? So we found quite a few of those to be quite problematic for many different reasons. The Muhammad one is a very different reason than, of course, the Nazi sympathizer, but the result of the committee was to rename the place. So perhaps it shouldn't be called Canyon of Heroes, but it should be called something else. Those who got the ticket tape parade, perhaps, or we haven't come up with the name yet, but and then to recontextualize, and so really provide more information. So if you look back, a lot of times, some of these individuals who got ticker tape parades, it were for political reasons. Somebody needed to favor somebody for something else, and then to appease them, they got a ticker tape parade. So, but I think so providing more information about why who this person was or why this name was there would possibly give a greater understanding of that work. Another monument that was discussed by the public and internally was the Theodore Roosevelt sculpture at the entrance to the American Museum of Natural History, which is very prominent in Central Park in New York City, along the park. Okay, so the statue was created in 1940, and you know, just the imagery of it, whether it was intended to be so or not, it was said that, you know, the African American or the Black man and the Native American individual standing next to Theodore was representative of the continents. So they stood in for the continents. But again, you know, how we see them now is very different than how they were symbolized in the beginning. So there was, you know, uproar, particularly rightfully so, from the Black and Native communities to remove that sculpture, because it's it's a large sculpture, quite prominent, and it sort of really symbolized, you know, sort of racial hierarchy, and so for this particular monument, the commission decided to keep it in place, but add some other monuments to sort of tell a fuller story and to recontextualize what it is that we're looking at. So recently, and if you follow these kinds of monument news, you would hear that this is actually going to be removed. The museum have decided to remove it completely. And so we're in the process of doing that. So although there was an idea to keep it in place and sort of add more to it, the decision was made by the museum to eventually just remove it. Christopher Columbus, okay? And so within New York, Columbus has a prominent location at the base of Central Park in his own Columbus Circle, which is the South End Mall. And this piece was erected in 1829, and the circle itself in 1892. And the circle was recently renovated. So for certain individuals, Italians per se, you know, Christopher is a very important figure. For other individuals, indigenous Caribbean people, you know, he's sort of a bringer of genocide. And so the discussion was, and so if you know a little bit about the history, how this went up was when Italians were sort of ostracized and labeled as other. And so as a means to celebrate their heritage, they raised money themselves and sort of created this monument, and sort of that represented that. And so this was one of those that had a lot of discussion around. There was a lot of discussion around it. And so what does this mean to have this figure? And obviously, you know, depending on who you are, you have a very different perspective of this particular work. For this, and this is just one of 5 Christopher Columbus statues that are in New York, but this is the most prominent. So the result was, again, to remain in place and recontextualize. And so the idea was to really tell a fuller story of who Christopher Columbus was without removing the statue itself. There's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this. You know, what does it mean to remove something? Are you erasing history? Are you, you know, not providing an opportunity to have discussions around, you know, what happened here? But it's a very, very complicated discussion, you know, no matter what decision was made. It was very interesting that the 18-member commission didn't have a consensus on any of the sculptures or the artworks that I showed. And so that's why we ended up with these different types of results. And we don't have any sort of Native American monument anywhere in New York City, right? And so this was decided that we needed to add one. And what was interesting, when, like, again, when I say when you're creating something for a particular group of people, conversation is necessary. And having a lot of conversations to decide what is this monument to look like with the Native Americans in New York City, in New York. We found out that they don't want a monument, they want a place. And so this is a very different way of looking at that. And so a physical sculptural thing does nothing for Native American people, but a place will allow them to continue and to celebrate in ways that they feel most appropriate. And so, which is something very interesting that this sort of panel of individuals, which included a Native American person, wanted to suggest that a monument be created, but in conversation, it's more of a place, and a place is sort of more of a monument. And again, when we think of monuments, we think of memory and past memory, past event. But which is interesting, having conversations with Native Americans, none of these things are in the past, they're present. So there's no sense to memorialize it when it's about living it constantly in the present. And this brings us to the only artwork that there was consensus from the commission community. And this was the removal of a sculpture of a Dr. J. Marion Sims. Again, who had a prominent bronze sculpture of himself, which considered, and I'm putting quotes, the father of modern gynecology. And so if you don't know who this individual was, he experimented on enslaved women without their permission and without anesthesia, doing surgeries without anesthesia when anesthesia was available. A lot of what his experiments resulted in some gynecological techniques that are still used today. But again, it was it felt it was not appropriate to have this individual in a community that is surrounded by people of color to be memorialized in such a way in that space, in any space, but particularly in that space. And so it was decided to remove, relocate, and replace. And this is an image. I'm going to go more in depth with this one. So what was interesting was J. Marion Sims is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And so the idea was to remove the piece from its location, what was its current location, to relocate it in the cemetery where he's buried, and to replace it with another artwork. The cemetery is a private cemetery, but the people of Brooklyn didn't even want him to be in the cemetery. So he remains in storage as of late, and until he finds a home. So I want to talk about this one a little bit here. So throughout the history of this particular, and some of the other monuments that I mentioned in New York City, there have been a lot of dialogue around it. And I use the word dialogue in a very conservative way. But this one has a lot of history around the community wanted, for a long time wanted it to be removed. There's a lot of activation around it, where artists were sort of addressing the issue of why this was there. And so when it was eventually removed, it was quite a spectacular thing to behold, where the community came together to see the removal of this work. They came together to sort of celebrate and mourn the legacy that this individual has left in not just that community, but in the community of women all over the world. So this was one of the first ones that we were going to, as you remember, it's remove, relocate, and to sort of create a new work that was to replace it. And so this was one of the first projects that we did to replace the J. Marion Sims, and the process is still going on. And I want to go over this process with you, because for those of us who are out there who are going to delve into the idea of recreating monuments, I think there's a lot of lessons that we learned from this piece so far, and there's many more lessons to be learned. And so I'm going to share some of that with you. So one of the first things that we did when we removed the J. Marion Sims sculpture was to sort of convene a committee of the community. And the committee consisted obviously of city departments that has the jurisdiction over the space, some of the cultural institutions that surrounded the location, and some of the activists and groups that were just wanted to participate or wanted to be part of the process or have been part of the process for a long time. And so before we even began to talk about art, to talk about a replacement of art, we felt that that there needed to be a sort of a healing process, a process by which we sort of review, kind of, evaluate what the legacy of Sims was. Because again, for these things are still happening now, sort of how women of color are treated, how any person of color is treated in the medical field, and the lack of trust between the medical field and people of color. And so it was not, there needed to be a space for reflection, a space for healing, and a space for really sussing out what that legacy was. And so the first thing we did was to sort of, do such a convening, sort of like a symposium, where we invited people to sort of discuss and talk about through art, what was this legacy, and in doing so, what is the next legacy? So what do we do to replace this work, and so how does that work? And we needed to hear from many different groups of people for a long period of time, through a long process, to understand that. And so I'm sort of truncating this process a little bit. So just, and hopefully we could discuss it later during the conversation. But there was sort of an 18-month process before we even went into what is this artwork what the artwork needs to be, or what it would look like, or go through our artist selection process. Early on, I sort of mentioned, before we even begin our selection process, we go to the community and have these discussions. We don't have 18-month discussions with communities for our regular projects, but for monuments, I think a longer discussion is necessary, particularly when it is of a subject like this. And so 18 months, we work with this committee and the community, its surrounding community and community beyond, and to decide what is to happen. A lot of these conversations was to determine, what is to replace this work? What do people want to see, and what do they want the work to do? And it's important to highlight that. So what do you want the work to do is sort of an important question to ask, instead of what do you want the work to be? And so that was a lot of the conversation. So during our first, so we had a series of panels, and let me try to go back a little bit. So with this, we had like before I showed you our selection panels, and so we had a first artist selection. We had it in a place and at a time when people in the community could actually come and participate. We had it in the community on a weekend where people are not working, and so they could come and participate. Where we had the voting panelists and advisors. There were quite a few people in the room, and we sort of really opened it up a little bit, so everybody could be part of this voting process, to whittle the list of I think it was about 54 artists down to maybe 5 with some alternates. And so the community picked the artists that were to be considered, that were invited to do proposals. And then months later, we met with the artists who were providing proposals to present to the community. And we did it at the Museum of the City of New York, which is right across the street from the original site. And again, to sort of adhere to sort of the process a little bit, well, a lot, we separated the group into the voting members and to the advisory members. So within those 18 months of community input, it was very important for the arts voting members, the art committee, to understand what the community wanted. They wanted a piece that would really not sort of remember these women, the women that were named, but also remember those that were not named, and sort of to have an opportunity to to create an artwork that bring attention to the issue and to the space. And the panel meeting, the second panel meeting, lasted about 7 hours. And at the end, at the last 30 minutes of those 7 hours, when the artist that was selected wasn't the same artist that the community wanted, which was very interesting. Both artists were, women of color. Both did very similar types of projects, but the community, and I want to say the community because that's a very wide community, but the people who attended felt that one artist responded better to the proposal than the other, but the arts committee selected the other artist by a very close vote. And so this now erupted into a bit of a controversy. And you could see, I'm not going to go into it too much, but you could see a lot of the headlines in a lot of the newspapers that were about, and we could get into that later. But it's sort of like experts picked acclaimed sculptor Simone Lee to do a monument after backlash. A little-known local artist now has the job. And a lot of the articles weren't very correct in exactly what happened, but again, that's something one has to contend with. And betrayed, tricked, and undermined, an uproar in Harlem triggers calls for reform in New York City public art process. And there was a hearing about this, and there was a lot of discussion, but there was not really much change in how the process went, because again, the process was very open to having a discussion with the community. It's just that the end result was not what they expected. And then this conversation is continuing. So this is just to say that despite having as much input process, that there's always room for improvement. There's always room for bigger, better communication, and for a lot more to happen in that process. And here's another New Yorkers' race to build monuments runs into friction on the ground. Again, whenever, and I'm highlighting, I think it's very important to highlight some of the things that come up when doing this kind of work that poses a problem in the process, because I think it's important that we learn from these different situations and we adjust accordingly. Continue on. Again, I told you I'm going to just go all over the place. And so, during the Monument Commission, it was also noticed that most of the monuments that were, the majority of the monuments that were in our city collection were men, mostly white men. And so a separate initiative was established called She Built NYC. And so this was another way to memorialize, specifically women who had a great influence on New York City, again, because they were already left out for many years, left out of the conversation, left out of the collection. And so this was an opportunity to correct that, not to begin to correct that. And so through a process, an open process again, 7 women, 7 women were identified to have monuments built. Shirley Chisholm in Brooklyn, and they were mostly Boer represented. Billie Holiday in Queens, Catherine Walker in Staten Island, Elizabeth Jennings Graham in Manhattan, Dr. Helene Rodriguez Trias for the Bronx, and Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera for also Manhattan, but to represented the LGBTQ plus community. And so we're in the process of commissioning monuments to these women. And one of the first ones that we have completed, not completed, but completed the process so far, was the one for Shirley Chisholm. And the artist that was selected was an artist team, Amanda Williams on Alalik and Japhus. And so for Prospect Park. I'm going to share with you just a quick glance as to what that looks like, because one of the things that we're thinking of and we ask is sort of what does it look like when contemporary artists create contemporary sculpture and create contemporary monument, and how do they define that? And so we saw it as an opportunity to sort of recontextualize and to sort of rethink what it means to be, what something means to be a monument. A lot of, you say monument and people sort of think of bronze sculptures on a pedestal. And so we wanted to sort of get away from that a little bit by looking at very different conceptual artists whose work may not be in bronze figurative, and to see what we come up with. For this particular Shirley Chisholm memorial, there were 5 different proposals. This was the one that got selected. And all of them really had a really different way of looking at memorializing someone. And so this you could see as the inspiration for the work that you'll be seeing. And this is a 40-foot sculpture at the entrance of the south entrance of Prospect Park that shows Shirley in silhouette, but in a sort of representing many different aspects of her life. What you see on the ground is these bronze plaques that are meant to sort of highlight the women that came before Shirley and the women that came after Shirley Chisholm, understanding that she has a place in history, but she was influenced by others just as she's influencing others as well. And so this will become more of a living monument, a monument that is always activated, is always changing. And that's a sort of a different way to look at monuments. I'm going to give you some more views. And so sometimes you see her in full profile, and sometimes you see her head on, but it's again, really emphasizing the space as a prominent location in what is predominantly an African-American community. And so the idea of representation came to us, rear its head in an early part of our commissioning process in the early 90s, when we commissioned a work for a police precinct in the Bronx. And the artist that was selected to do so was John Ahern. And John, if you know his work, he sort of creates these sculptural pieces of people in the neighborhood, these busts. And what he did do was he would create 2, keep one for himself and give one to the individual who's represented. And so when commissioning a work, we like to think about the work being for the people, by the people, about the people in that location. And so, thinking about, John lived in the South Bronx, he still lives there. These are the people who live there as well. And so when a police station was going to be created, he had the fantastic idea of, memorializing some of the individuals in the Bronx and sort of illustrating them on your typical way of memorializing someone by placing them on a pedestal. So he selected these 3 individuals, Raymond and Toby is the dog, Delisha and Corey, and created bronze representations of them and, placed them on a pedestal in front of the police station. And this was one of our first early controversies, because people felt that these were not the people that needed to be placed on pedestals, right? These didn't represent anybody of importance. These isn't, and some of the comments that were made about these individuals were really hurtful. I'm not even going to repeat some of them, but so these, in that community, these were important people. These people represented them. But for the greater Bronx, that was not the case. And so unfortunately, very shortly after they were installed, they were removed. And again, these have all very long stories that I can't get into right now, but you could always Google and research them. And so this is what the front of the police station looks like now. To make sure that they never return, perhaps, trees were planted in front of the pedestals and flagpoles were placed on the pedestals themselves. The sculptures live right now in Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens, where a lot of the programming around within Socrates for the community around focused on representation, and what you're seeing here is these are drawings of of kids from the local schools in the community that shows that, that discusses how are you represented? And so, how do you see yourself in sort of the urban environment? And most of them never see themselves in the urban environment around New York City. And so this was very instrumental. So they lived on as a means of engaging conversation about representation, which is super important. Moving along, so we have a lot of traditional, what we call traditional representation of memorials. This is a Frederick Douglass Memorial in Frederick Douglass Circle in Manhattan, and Allison Starr's Harriet Tubman Memorial in Harlem. And when I say traditional, it's sort of the use of bronze and figuration, but we also really experiment with other types of memorials. And this is a Houston Conwell's Langston Hughes Memorial at the Schomburg Center for Research on Black History and Culture. And what you're seeing here is the last resting place of Langston Hughes. His ashes are interred in the center of the artwork. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of artists are re-looking at the way of how to memorialize things or creating new monuments. And sometimes those new ways of looking at monuments have been a little hard to swallow by some of the public. This is Hank Willis Thomas's Unity, which was installed in 2019. And a few days after we installed it, somebody complained that, that symbol of the one finger being raised was an ISIS symbol. And so we had to, of course, address that. And what Hank was more referring to was, if you come across the Brooklyn Bridge, at some point you look to the south and you see the Statue of Liberty, and the statue is making that same gesture with raising her hand and holding the torch. And Hank wants to reference that and sort of creating this gesture that we use all the time. Is it pointing to heaven? Is it saying number one? It's saying, is it sort of raising his hand? So it's interesting how it's interpreted. We were happy to see, though, that the public engaged a different representation of that piece, and it became very central to a lot of the Black Lives Matter movements as a symbol, and it has remained that symbol till now, again, which is very important. Melissa Calderon, Para Roberto. If you know who Roberto Clemente is, you probably know him as a baseball player, but he's also a humanitarian. And so there are many different Roberto Clemente memorials around and showing that his baseball prowess, but he is also an enormous humanitarian. And so this work was about his humanitarianism, which a lot of people may not be aware of. And so Melissa, who is of Puerto Rican descent, who does live not too far from this work, wanted to have a very special relationship with creating this work for Roberto Clemente. Again, really, what does it look like when people who sort of live like their heroes create monuments to them? And so that's very, very important for us. I also want to point out that one does not have to have experience creating public art or monuments to be considered with us, because that is limiting in and of itself. Most individuals who have that experience sort of has the means to have that experience, and so we tend not to limit it to that. I see my time is coming close, but I'm just gonna quickly. This is a Jeffrey Gibson piece, but once you enter my house, it becomes our house. And this is part of a monument series at Socrates Sculpture Park, really recontextualizing, really looking at what a monument means. And Jeffrey has Native American heritage, is Native American, and so when we talked earlier about speaking to Native American people and they wanting a place, this monument is about place, and so it becomes the infrastructure, the stage, for a lot of different activities, for a lot of different artists to interact with, and it became quite special. Paul Ramirez Jonas's Eternal Flame, sort of re-looking at what it means to have an eternal flame and paying homage to the communal and cultural importance of cooking. So again, this is a central grill that allows for different folks to use it at the same time and cook different food, and the camaraderie that happens around cooking and food and sharing, cultural differences and similarities is very important to this work. We've seen a lot of Black Lives Matter murals throughout the US. And this one in particular is quite special, I think, in that it sort of really speaks to another memorial and another space that's not too far from this location in downtown Manhattan, which is another work by Lorenzo Pace called Triumph of the Human Spirit, which is in the center of this image. And the memorial, the mural itself was done by three young artists who, represent, just the three of them represent different gender identities, different religions, different, class and opportunities and places of origin. And so they highlighted their, what it means to be Black in the city through this mural, through this mural. And so you had Black by T.J. Mohammed, Lives by Sophia Dawson, and Matter by Patrice Payne. And this location is quite prominent, as interesting as well, in that this is in the municipal district downtown, where the courthouses and the jails and the immigration services, all facilities that have a huge influence on being Black in the United States, surround this. So this is, again, location is very important to the meaning about this work. And then there's works like this, which again, looking at new ways of picturing monuments. This is Boulevard of African Monarchs by Kenseth Armstead at 116th Street in Manhattan. And Kenseth wants to sort of really focus on the abstraction, a monument being the abstractions of monuments, and sort of this sort of, references, again, being Black, but really looking at it in an architectural and cultural form. And Abigail DeVille, Light of Freedom in Madison Square Park, where if you know anything about the history of Madison Square Park or the Statue of Liberty's torch, this is the first place that the torch sat while they raised money for the Statue of Liberty. And so her bringing it back and contextualizing it in a different way in terms of its freedom, its connection to freedom is very important. And I'm going to just show one more, and so because I really want to really open it up for some of the conversations that we're hope to have. And so this is Admiral Farragut at the same Madison Square Park. And this is a piece by Christoph Wodiczko called Monument. And what Christoph did was he interviewed 12 refugees and superimposed through video, through projection, their conversations and themselves onto this Admiral Farragut monument to sort of, with an audio component, to really talk about what it means to be a refugee in the US today. And some of the stories were quite painful to listen to, but very important to hear. So this is, I just wanted to give you again, I hope most of what our dialogue will, I want you to give this thought to the images I showed and the complications around creating monuments and giving voice to the ones who haven't been heard from before. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hopefully open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kendall. And I'm sorry I didn't thank you at the beginning, but this was really interesting. And I do have a question just to break the ice. At the beginning, you talked about the fact that the Native American community decided not to have a monument, but to have a place. I wonder whether you could tell us more about this place. And I find it, it speaks volumes, the fact that they don't want a monument actually. And this brings us to the upcoming seminar next week, because we will talk about, alternatives, forms of memorializing underrepresented communities. So I'm curious to hear how about the place for the Native American community in New York.
So all this is in really early discussion right now. But I think what was most important to that is that we who are not Native American, who are not part of that culture, sort of imposed what we thought someone would want. And so that's always a problem, right? And so luckily, part of our process is to really speak to people and listen and hear. And we spoke to quite a few different Native American groups, and every last one of them is like, what, monument? No, this doesn't make sense for our culture, but we do need a space. We do need a place to continue to live. We have been displaced. We have lost our land. We have lost where we could converge as a group. And we no longer have that. So if you want to honor us, please give us our space back, our place back. And so it was surprising, not surprising to hear this, but it sort of made us rethink, one, how we approach people to discuss things, and making sure that you do have actual conversations before you even go beyond saying we should do a monument. And so the conversation would have been about, what does this monument look like? And luckily we didn't approach it that way. It was like, what do you want? And then we have this monument, we have this capability to create a monument, and it became, no, we want a place, a space. So so again, we still earlier in the process, but we are no longer pursuing a monument as defined as such. And this is not to say that spaces can't be monuments in and of itself, but we're no longer pursuing a physical, sculptural monument.
Okay, thank you so much. And I was also wondering, then I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I was also wondering whether in the committees which participate to the discussion, you have included historians, because one of the best conversation I had revising policies was with the city of Munich in Germany, which is a city which is interested by a strong Nazi history, and so they have revised, all the presence of buildings and monuments, and they work at close level with historians. And if you have ever thought about dematerialized form of memorialization. Again, I'm quoting Germany, the project Stumbling Stones, in which the victims of the Holocaust have been memorialized all over Europe with these blocks of stones, inside, the pavement with the names, date of birth and date of death.
To answer your first question, yes, we had individuals from New York Historical Society as a member of the commission, but also too is part of what they were meant to do. The commission was to sort of guide us in establishing guidelines for when not just us creating monuments, but from others as well. And as part of that, you must come in with a historian to his historical report / historian to outline, one, the importance of this individual event, and to suss out, what part of that needs to be, addressed, or so. Yeah, so there, historic accuracy, historians and reports like that are part of coming in with any kind of memorial. In terms of how that is realized and how that is contextualized in the form of the memorial itself, we look to artists who, and I don't want to use this phrase too much, think outside the box, but to think of different ways of, because the project you describe is amazing. It's sort of like it's there, but you don't see it until you're able to flip this. But it's sort of embedded in the into the soul of that community, of that city, that's not always visible. So we found that, giving the opportunity to artists to, in their creative ways of dealing with things, the opportunity to do that is super important, and not coming with prescribed ways of realizing what a memorial is, or prescribed ways of what the memorials need to be. Again, really thinking about it more of what do you want it to do versus what do you want it to be. Though we are limited to having it survive in a city structure, so it can't be, of certain types of material, but we found that artists are very creative in coming up with solutions like that.
Great, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to step in for real quick. I'm Emma, and I'm a student for Professor Marina Puglise's Contemporary Art course at CCA. And I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll help relay them. Or if you want, you can unmute your mic and just ask directly. I just want to remind people that that chat was also an option.
I have a question. What does it look like to cultivate like an open and creative environment to, you know, in order to collaborate with the community? And because you mentioned the symposiums and like the more open voting, but you know, I was just curious about more examples, and I guess this is like almost a two-parter because you know you mentioned like some pitfalls in the system, and I think it's clear that there are. And I was just wondering like what kind of changes do you think are necessary to build more like equitable relationships between the administrative roles and the community?
Yeah, so to answer that first question, that what it looks like to engage the community has to come from that community, right? So back in, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and in the beginning, we did things like, you know, we had our panel meetings in our offices downtown or somewhere else during the day. And so this is not the time when people have jobs, people have lives, you know, they're not gonna come to pick some art thing in the middle of, you know, go, you know, some work time and sort of do that. So basically speaking to that community and say, hey, one, we are here to do this. You know, is this something that you want to be part of? We have to do it anyway, but we want you to be involved. Who do we need to talk to be part of this process? Where do we need to have these meetings? When do we need to have these meetings? How do we need to have these meetings? So it become, you know, you have to, if you're serious about engaging the community, you have to come in with some tools that you know will work and some tools that you don't know about, and be flexible in addressing that. Be open and honest about, you know, there are time constraints, there are budget constraints, there are procedural constraints, but you know, there are ways of working around that for the most part. So this is what, so we hold our panels in places and times, and give voice as much as possible to the people we need to hear from, because again, they have to live with the work and they have to own it. And so we are just facilitators, and we see ourselves as just facilitators of this within this process. So that's my answer to that. What was your second question?
My second question was just like what kind of changes do you think are necessary in order to build those more like equitable and just collaborative relationships between the community and the administration?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to say what the changes should be, but I think it's easier, it's more, it makes more sense to say, to sort of come in with a set of tools, but you kind of have to tailor it per the situation, because something may have worked fantastically, you know, 2 months ago with this very same community in this particular location, but it didn't work. The same thing is not going to work, you know, now, because the people are different, or the situation is slightly different, or the circumstances are a little different. So you kind of almost, you always have, I think we always have to start from scratch to a certain degree, and not assume that, you know, oh, this worked for this one, it's going to work for everything. So there is no like one size fit all situation, despite, you know, the communities might be common or have something in common, or the project itself might be the same. So yeah, I think it's approaching it with that knowledge or that understanding that, you know, you can't take any of that for granted, and you have to, again, give each of these individuals their space, and allow for flexibility in that process.
Thank you.
Hassan in the chat says, I wonder how anyone can, especially a community, easily give up or do not fight enough. But I also think that they might have fought but could have not succeeded. I want to know, isn't it possible to get lawyers who can fight for them and get their land?
And that is a hugely, complicated and convoluted situation. And within, and I think you're talking about the Native American people, within the purview of the monument and the space, we could work within that. We can work within that environment to find a space. Not a space doesn't necessarily mean land, but some physical space where hopefully with some outdoor locations for them to be able to do what it is that they want to do. Conversations about what the space needs to be is important, and then see where we could accommodate that. But you don't ask somebody to participate in something and then just let them go. You have to work with them to make sure that, again, communicate that there are limitations, but communicate what is possible within the purview of the individuals who are participating in the process. So I hope that answered that question.
And Aikacia asked, this might be a bit off topic, but what are some challenges in dealing with different communities and, for lack of a better word, being on everyone's good side? I know it's hard to please everyone, so I'm sure it's a loaded question.
Yes, it's a loaded question. and I don't know that being on everybody's good side is a good idea. But I think what is most important is transparency and openness and the communication aspect of it. You're not going to please everybody, but you should let them know why they aren't being pleased. And I think when we do have these panel meetings, what I find, the more people that attend, the better, because I allow for everybody who wants to speak. And sometimes I allow for those who don't want to speak as well, because again, different situations, people have different ways of communicating. But what I found is that even if your point of view isn't your choice of artist, or your point of view isn't the one that ends up being selected or whatever, at least you know why. You know how it got there, and you know how what transpired for you to get your way or not get your way. And I think that's important. So yeah, that's, I mean, and if you do something that pleases everybody, you may not be doing something right. But if you do something that doesn't please everybody as well, that so there's a balance there. But at least people know how things went down. I think it's important for people to understand that.
And Hassan is asked again in the chat, can anyone who is not a member or connected to the organization produce artwork in its kind to create social engagement?
Yeah, quick answer to that. So we have many different types of many different ways of artists and individuals who want to do something in city environment to be able to do so. Most of them it's easier if it's a temporary artwork. We have most of the land in New York City is owned by two agencies, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Parks and Recreation, or the Department of Parks. And they both have art programs and temporary art programs. So very rolling, easy application processes to put stuff on park or DOT land. So that's one thing that's really good about New York City. They give a lot of opportunity, and that's just from the city perspective. There are a lot of private organizations that commission art as well. There's a lot of individuals with property ownership that are open to artists doing things on their spaces. So that's why you see quite a variety of art here.
And Stephanie asks, how can culture plans and public art plans aid in this process?
I think, and this is like right off the top of my head, just something that I've noticed is one of the things that slows things down or sort of intimidates people in creating things within their public environment is the permitting process, or not understanding what the rules are. And I think if you make these things very easy and accommodating and just putting it out there, then it allows for many other people to be able to sort of activate their spaces. A lot of times when we see spaces that are beautifully activated, it has happened organically. It's not something that's necessarily programmed. but providing an open space and saying, hey, this is a space that you could play music, you could paint, you could do whatever, and understanding what the rules are. Because a lot of the rules are meant for safety purposes and to protect individuals within the space. And so it's easy to work around these rules, but a lot of people don't know that. And so if it's something that's a huge, arduous permitting process that takes months, and when something happens that's very contemporary and you want to respond to it, it takes 2 months, it takes away from that. So if anything, whoever is planning public spaces or city planning or whatever, afford the opportunity for organic things to happen in spaces that are easily accessible by individuals or groups of people with a clear distinction as to what the rules are, I think is important.
I have a question, if it's possible. Kendall, thank you so much for all of the great examples, and thank you for sharing both successes and also areas of learning for you and your team. I think that's so important. And to bring this back a little bit to our local, context in San Francisco, I'm thinking of a recent scandal that took place in public art related to Lava Thomas's commissioning of a monument to honor Dr. Maya Angelou that was meant to go in front of the public library. And, in a short way, I think this might have been a situation where the voting panel selected her work. The advisory panel and group, wanted a different work. And so they decided to kind of stop the commission and relaunch the call with a few sort of words edited, which caused an uproar in the community who was in support of Lava. So I'm curious, just in thinking about one, I guess, aligning constituencies and what work goes into this process ahead of time. But also, I'm curious how you kind of approach healing and reparations when the process hasn't maybe gone as well as expected.
Mm-hmm. And remind me again how it's ended up. The original artist is going to be working on the sculpture, right?
That is how it ended. There was, quite a few kind of public art, open forums where many people spoke on behalf of Lava Thomas. And in the end, she did receive the commission for the work that was selected by the voting panel.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm happy to hear that part of it, in that, you go through a process, and then the process is what the process is as established. And you can't just change the process in the middle of it and be like, I don't like this, whatever. So that there's a problem with trust of the process. And this is something that we deal with all the time. People, though I think our process is very open and transparent, and what does happen is that it's a long process. So there are opportunities where we are looking for input early on where it's not really a thing. And you may be like, oh, I don't need to participate in this right now. It's just like a discussion. But when it becomes a thing and you realize, well, wait a minute, how did this get here so quick? Or how did this get here and I didn't know about it? And that's when you have an input, but then there's a history to that. So there's a lot of these different kinds of issues, but I think in a nutshell, you kind of have to honor the process. Otherwise, it becomes you don't want to set certain precedents where you go through it and then all of a sudden somebody doesn't like it with power and decides, well, let's just throw this out and do somebody else. That hurts everybody. That hurts my program here in New York City. Because people are like, well, look what they did in San Francisco. Why can't we do this here? So my quick answer to that is I'm happy that the original artist who was selected is actually going to do the work. But in the future, just to be transparent about the process as much as possible.
Kendall, you are an artist yourself. Don't you feel like all this process of sharing decision with, the community, the expert in this and that, has the risk to diminish the freedom of the artist, and also the provocative value that art has to have on the one hand? I'm quoting one of our students who, in a discussion about a monument which was removed, the Tilted Arc, I mean, it's a historic, very, very famous case, she said, but art has to be daring, art has to be controversial. What do you think about this as an artist and as part of, of an institution who works for public art?
I'm going to respond to that in two slightly different ways. One, as an artist, I think being an artist in this position, and I always say I'm an artist who works as an arts administrator, not an administrator who happens to be an artist, which is slightly different. It's important for the artist to do what the artist does. It's important to give the artist that space to do what he, she, they do, right? And so you kind of have to work, if you remember that first illustration, community, art, and the space, they all are equal. But within the process, it's important that the community, and listen carefully to what I'm saying here. It's important that the community do not determine what the art is. It's important for the artist to not determine who the community is. And it's important for the space to, so all these things within the process, all of these individuals have their place, right? So the artist needs to understand who the community is and their needs and their wants throughout the project, but they can't, unless they're from there, they can't really define that. They have to take that information and filter it through their process and to give the community, to give the project something that in a way that they least suspect that is the artist's work. And so there is this sort of balancing maneuvery kind of thing that happens. And when I think when that breaks apart, that's when you have, it's hard to maneuver by, mind you, but when that does break apart, then that's when you have problems. To see, and I'm going to make a statement here, I think the majority of the commissioned public artwork throughout is not that great. Okay, I don't think it's that great. And because that's where that breaks apart. Then you have people, and I hear it all the time. I have panels every week, and I hear in the panels, I hear it all the time. You have people saying, "Oh, why don't you do this? And it should be better if this is this." And they're designing with the artist, right? And if the artist isn't strong enough to say, "Hold up, no, I will take this into consideration," and then filter it through their process and give you something else. If that doesn't happen, then it becomes this person designing with the artist who's not the artist, and that happens a lot, right? And that's a watered down version of the artist thing. So I think whenever you go through a process, whatever that process is, it's very important to establish, and people don't usually listen, but it's important to establish what your role is here, right? The other day I was having a conversation with a group, and they asked me a question about what do I think of this individual? And I was very stoic about, and they're like, "Well, how are you supposed to do a project for us when you're not excited about this individual?" I said, "That is not my role. My role is to, realize your excitement in the project. You are in close proximity with this individual. You've sort of lived with, grown with them. They're a part of your family. They're not part of my family. So I can't impose this should be like this. This is for you to do and for me to help you realize." And so that's very important to, in the early part of whatever the process is, to say, well, this is your role in this process. This is the artist's role, and this is what the space is going to allow. And each one of these groups of people who have jurisdiction over has their time on the stage. And you can't mix them up too much because it becomes a watered down version of something.
Thank you. We just have 3 minutes.
I have a quick question, if I may. I want to ask about the educational component of possibilities in relation to the selection of artists and taking away those works. I'm not talking about leaving those works up and educating the community about them. They're too hurtful that, and who needs to, the community knows what is represented there. But beyond the artist selection process, do you engage the community in educational programming about what's being represented here and the public issues involved?
The quick answer to that is yes. So most of our processes are like an average of 3 years long. that's an average to short time span to working on any given project is 3 years. And so, throughout that time, we're moving through it with this core group of people coming in, depending on what part of the process you're in, people moving out. And we're really thinking about the longevity of that project. Everything that we do is meant to be up for like 100 years. And so how do, the process that we're going through right now, if you're in it, you understand it, you know the history of it, whatever, but how do people experience that, or how do you relay the knowledge of that after it's in for a long time? And some of it is easy and some of it is not so much, and some of it needs constant upgrading. So that is part of the planning of the project as well. Sometimes it's a collaboration with an entity that has established roots for a long time that could keep activating the piece through programming. Sometimes it's part of the piece itself, or sometimes the piece isn't complete until it's activated. So there's many different ways of doing that, but it's something that is discussed, addressed from the very beginning. So as you're planning, some of the things that you think about when you're planning the work is, how are we going to maintain this? How are we going to use it as an educational tool? And sometimes those bits of information will drive what the piece actually is.
Okay, thank you so much. Time to wrap up. Thank you so much, Kendall, for everything. This was super interesting. I want to thank all of my students for the collaboration. I want to remind everybody that next week, same time, we will talk with Rami Crawford about alternative ways to memorialize underrepresented communities and community engagement. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.